Okay, students, we're going to go ahead and move on now and talk about anxiety disorders and also obsessive compulsive disorder. It's important to recognize that with the last revision of the DSM, obsessive compulsive disorder has now been seen or marked as a category in and of itself. So it has been separated from anxiety disorders, though in many ways these two disorders are still very much connected. The types of anxiety disorders that we're going to be discussing in this class include phobia. We're going to go over specific phobias, social phobias, and also agoraphobia. We're going to talk about panic disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, and then we will be talking about post-traumatic stress disorder. When we're through talking about these anxiety disorders, then we're going to circle back and hit on obsessive compulsive disorder, and we will talk a little bit about some of the causalities that might be connected to these disorders. So what is an anxiety disorder? It's a category of disorder whose hallmark is intense feelings of fear or dread that is long-standing or disruptive. Anxiety disorders are incredibly common. There are several subtypes that fall into this category, as I've mentioned. I've already talked a little bit about the ones that we're going to be discussing in this lecture. But what I really want you to take away from this slide is that it's a feeling of fear, it's a feeling of dread, and it's long-standing, and it disrupts the person's ability to manage their day-to-day life. So some of the most common anxiety disorders include phobias, and phobias are strong, irrational fear. It's a strong, irrational fear of an object or situation. There are basically two kinds of phobias. There are specific phobias and there are social phobias. A specific phobia is a fear and avoidance of specific stimuli and situations. It affects about 9 to 15% of adults. It's not uncommon. Nearly everyone knows someone who has been impacted by a specific phobia. The most common specific phobias include heights, which is acrophobia, and spiders, which are arachnophobia. Other typical phobias include snakes and also closed-in spaces. So why is it that we have a tendency to fear things like spiders, snakes, heights, closed-in spaces? Well, I want us to take a second here to think back to our fight or flight syndrome. We talked about this just a little bit back in the bio section, and this links back to this idea that we're hardwired to react very strongly to things that we fear. So either we're going to fight or we're going to flight, we're going to run away. And we call this a certain level of biological preparedness. So in other words, we're set up to fear snakes and spiders, but not, say, books. And really what that tells us is that it's a lot easier to develop a phobia of something that we're biologically set up to fear, rather than something that we are not. Social phobia is a strong, irrational fear related to social situations. It impacts about 13% of adults. Some individuals have what we call a generalized social phobia, so they just generally don't like any social situations. But usually what happens is there's a specific social situation that the person tries to avoid. The most typical social situation that people avoid is public speaking. In fact, I've had many students wonder how I can lecture in large lecture halls, and they've gone up to their faculty or their professors and have said, I don't see how you can possibly lecture to 100 students or 125 students or even 30 students, because that fear of public speaking is pretty typical. Another typical social phobia, surprisingly, is the fear of eating in front of other people. And really what this stems at, or what the root of this is fear of being judged or being looked at negatively. And this can grow to impact areas of your life. I'll talk a little bit about panic disorder. It's another subtype of anxiety disorder. It's a disorder whose hallmark is panic attacks. A panic attack is an episode of intense fear and anxiety accompanied by physical and psychological symptoms that come without warning or obvious cause. So it'd be things like heart palpitations, your heart beating very, very quickly, breathing difficulty, chest pain, sweating, dizziness, this sort of fear of impending doom, a loss of peripheral vision. The person feels as if they are dying. Some people say it feels as if I'm going to have a heart attack. At least 30%, that's almost a third of the population, have had at least one panic attack. So it's pretty typical. A lot of people have had this experience, but only about 2 to 3% of the population suffers from panic disorder. So what can bring on a panic attack? What's interesting is that we find that rumination can lead to panic attacks. So what happens is that the person thinks about the same things over and over and over again. They get themselves worked up. It kicks in their fight or flight, and they have a panic attack. What's scary about panic disorder is that it can lead to agoraphobia. And agoraphobia comes from the Greek word agora, which is marketplace or open space. Agoraphobia is a fear of open spaces or public places, really a fear of being away from home. So what can happen is a person has panic attacks, and they become afraid or concerned that they're going to have a panic attack in a public place. And so what they start to do is they start to avoid going out. They start to avoid certain places. Then they start to avoid being too far away from home until slowly, they narrow their circle and ultimately cannot leave their own home. Generalized anxiety disorder, also known as GAD, its hallmark is excessive anxiety and worry that is long-lasting, which is not focused on any particular object or situation. It affects about 3% of the population. Some psychologists call this a free-floating anxiety. It's really marked by constant worry. So it's very different than phobias, which are very, very specific. So things like public speaking or spiders. This is just constant worry about any particular thing. And we almost always, with people that struggle with this disorder, we see a lot of problems around sleep, and that their worry and their anxiety gets the best of them, and they're unable to sleep at night. Post-traumatic stress disorder is experienced by some after a traumatic event, whose symptoms include persistent re-experience of the trauma and avoidance of anything associated with that trauma. Post-traumatic stress disorder is marked by an occurrence that we call flashbacks. This disorder was first diagnosed when Vietnam veterans were returning back in the 1970s. So when a person experiences a violent crime, a crime to their person, if they have lived through a natural disaster, if they've lived through war, at first they are in a state of shock. But then as they come out of that shock, they can develop what we call post-traumatic stress disorder. So in other words, if they are put into a situation that mimics or somehow reminds them of the trauma, they have a flashback of that trauma and they regress. It's as if they re-experience that trauma again. An example of this is that there's a case study of a rape victim who had been raped in a closet, and she had done a lot of psychological work to get better. And then when she took a flight and used the restroom, which is a very small, closed-in space, she had a flashback and said it was as if she was starting from square one. She had to start all over again. When we talk about causes of anxiety, we really focus in on either the biology or the environment. When we think about biological factors, there is some work being done around genetic predisposition. We know some of these anxiety disorders seem to run in families, and there is some predisposition toward anxiety. So what does that really mean? Physiologically or biologically, what's going on? We almost always see that people who are anxious or suffer from anxiety disorders have very sensitive fight or flight response. That means their sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems can go into overdrive. They might have a sensitive amygdala. Remember, the amygdala houses emotional memories. Newer research that's coming out finds that you can create anxiety in rats by manipulating the gut biome. Remember, that gut biome is all the bacteria that lives in our digestive system. And we find that if we manipulate that, we can create abnormalities in the brain's neurotransmitter systems, primarily because we believe, or researchers seem to indicate, that the bulk of things like serotonin actually seems to come from our digestive systems. Some environmental factors that we consider include conditioning. Is an anxiety disorder a learned way of thinking? Is it developed through classical conditioning? Is it developed through observational learning? A lot of psychologists would say that, for the most part, people are probably biologically prepared. In other words, they're biologically sensitive or set up or predisposed to develop an anxiety disorder, and then they just simply learn it. They're simply conditioned to it. All right, we're going to take a couple minutes here to talk about obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD. This is a disorder marked by the presence of obsessions and compulsions. The person becomes obsessed with certain thoughts and then feels a compulsion to do certain things. The DSM now separates this out from anxiety disorders. What makes obsessive compulsive disorder distinct is that it is marked by obsessions, which are these unwanted, persistent thoughts, and then a person engages in compulsions, these sort of repetitive, meaningless behaviors, in order to quell or calm the obsessive thoughts. So they'll do things like a lot of washing or checking, ordering, counting, obsessive cleaning, all those sorts of things in order to temporarily calm those obsessive thoughts. We find that about 1% of Americans struggle with OCD. So what are some causes of OCD? We know that there are certain biological factors, possibly genetic predispositions, and imbalances in certain neurotransmitters. Some psychologists believe that OCD is maintained by operant conditioning. So a person may be genetically predisposed, but it is that cycle of obsession and compulsion that maintains the OCD cycle and the OCD disorder. So the person has the obsessive thoughts or that obsessive, say, preoccupation with germs. And then what they do is they feel a compulsion to clean things. And then the cleaning seems to make the stress disappear. But then the obsession comes back. So what they do is they go back and they compulsively clean things. And it temporarily makes the stress of that thought disappear.